No dowry, no marriage, he said. London, 1851. The crystal chandeliers of Kensington House blazed with 1,000 candles, casting dancing shadows across the marble floors. Audrey Ashford moved carefully through the grand ballroom, her silk gown, once the finest she owned, now 2 seasons old, whispering against the polished floor. There she is, the hushed voices murmured behind gloved hands and ivory fans. The girl who was to marry Duke Thornfield. Poor thing. How utterly mortifying. Only 6 weeks prior, she had been the most envied young woman in London society, engaged to one of England's most eligible bachelors, future mistress of Thornfield Manor, destined for a life of luxury and respect. Now she attended her first social event since the incident. The night Duke Jasper Thornfield had shattered her world with 5 brutal words in front of 200 witnesses. No dowry, no marriage, Miss Ashford. Oh, astonishing, isn't it? But before we reveal how this incredible moment came to be, I have a question for you. Do you believe that destiny is written in the stars, or do we make it ourselves? Let me know in the comments below, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? I love reading you stories. Now, settle in, hit that subscribe button to join our family, and let me tell you the truth about what really happened. Happy New Year. As we enter 2026, I want to take a moment to thank you, wherever you're watching from. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions have changed my life and helped this channel grow beyond my wildest dreams. This year, I want you to remember one thing. Keep believing in destiny. We have so many more stories to tell together. Stay tuned. Now let's go into what really happened. The orchestra played a waltz, but Audrey heard only the cruel symphony of whispers that followed her like a shadow. She kept her spine straight, her chin lifted, the last remnants of Ashford pride holding her together when everything else had crumbled. Did you hear? Her family lost everything in bad investments. The Duke chose Lady Cordelia Ravenscroft instead. Railway fortune, you know. I heard Miss Ashford actually thought he loved her. How naive. Audrey's fingers tightened around her fan until the delicate ivory spokes threatened to crack. She had told herself she could endure this, one evening, one ball, to show London society that she would not be destroyed by Jasper's cruelty, that she was not broken. But every glance, every barely concealed smirk, every pitying look from women who had once called her friend, it all felt like tiny daggers finding their mark. Then she saw him. Duke Jasper Thornfield stood across the ballroom in his immaculate evening dress, his dark hair perfectly arranged, his posture radiating the confidence of a man who had made what he considered a sensible decision. Beside him, Lady Cordelia Ravenscroft glowed in emerald silk and diamonds that could buy a small estate. Her hand rested possessively on his arm. Their eyes met across the crowded room. For one fragile moment, Audrey thought she saw something flicker in his expression. Regret, perhaps? Recognition of what they'd once shared. But then Jasper's gaze slid past her as if she were merely part of the wallpaper. He leaned down to whisper something in Cordelia's ear. The heiress laughed. A crystalline sound that carried across the ballroom, and they turned away. That dismissal hurt more than his public rejection ever had. My dear Audrey, Jasper had said 6 weeks ago, his voice echoing through the marble foyer of this very house during the midsummer ball. I must speak frankly. This engagement cannot continue. She had stood frozen, her champagne glass trembling in her hand, unable to comprehend his words. Your family's situation has become impossible to ignore. I have obligations to my estates, to my title, to the Thornfield name. I require a wife who can bring substantial resources to our union. But Jasper, she had whispered, you said you loved. Love is a luxury, Miss Ashford, one that men in my position cannot afford. Duty to one's family name, to one's legacy, these must take precedence. Surely you understand. He had said it loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, loud enough for the whispers to begin immediately. loud enough to ensure she could never pretend it had been a mutual decision. I have met someone whose fortune and connections would better serve the Thornfield legacy. Lady Cordelia has agreed to accept my proposal. I trust you will conduct yourself with grace and understanding in this matter. And then, worst of all, he had simply walked away, as if 3 years of courtship, of promises, of her naive belief in his affection meant nothing more than a business transaction that had fallen through. A gentle hand touched Audrey's elbow, pulling her from the painful memory. "Audrey, darling." Her mother, Eleanor Ashford, appeared at her side, her face lined with worry beneath her carefully arranged hair. "Perhaps we should take some air? The terrace is lovely this evening." It was a rescue disguised as a suggestion. "Yes," Audrey managed, her voice barely steady. "Yes, I think that would be wise." As they moved toward the terrace doors, she caught one final whisper from a cluster of young women near the refreshment table. "No dowry, no marriage. That's what the Duke told her directly. Can you imagine? At least he was honest about what she's worth." Something inside Audrey hardened in that moment, transformed from wounded grief into something colder, sharper, something that felt dangerously like resolve. The night air was cool against her flushed cheeks. London spread before them, gaslit and glittering, indifferent to her humiliation. "I cannot stay in this city, Mother," Audrey said quietly. "I cannot endure another evening of this. Another month of watching him parade his new fortune on his arm, while I'm treated as the cautionary tale of what happens to women with nothing to offer." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Audrey, we have nowhere else to." "Ashford Manor." Her mother looked stricken. "The estate? Darling, you know it's barely habitable. We haven't been able to maintain it in years. The roof leaks. The grounds are overgrown." "It's still ours," Audrey interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "It's still the Ashford family seat, even if it's crumbling. Even if society considers it worthless." She turned to face her mother fully. "I would rather live in a crumbling manor that bears our name than remain here as London's favorite object of pity." Eleanor studied her daughter's face, and perhaps saw something new there, something that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago. Not the heartbroken girl who had loved the Duke, but a woman who had been forged in humiliation and was emerging as something harder, more determined. "Very well," Eleanor said softly. "If that is what you need, then we will go to Ashford Manor. We still have that, at least, our name, our history. Those cannot be taken from us, no matter what fortune we've lost." Audrey looked back through the terrace doors one last time. Inside, the ball continued. The music, the laughter, the glittering crowd that had once welcomed her and now whispered about her downfall. Jasper was dancing with Cordelia now, holding her the way he had once held Audrey, smiling down at her with an expression that looked almost like tenderness. "No dowry, no marriage?" Audrey whispered to herself, letting the words settle into her bones. "He made his choice. He chose money over everything we shared." She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin with the same Ashford pride that had carried her family through centuries. "Then let him have his fortune. Let him have his railway heiress and his practical marriage. I will go to our ancestral home, and I will survive this. I will rebuild our name, even if I must do it alone, even if I must do it with nothing." Eleanor squeezed her daughter's hand. Together they slipped quietly from the terrace, leaving the ball behind, leaving London behind with their dignity intact if nothing else. What neither of them knew, what Jasper Thornfield and his glittering society would never suspect, was that the worthless Ashford Manor sat upon a secret that would change everything. A secret that would make Audrey the most powerful woman in England. A secret that would bring the Duke crawling back, begging for the fortune he had dismissed so callously. But that night, walking away from the chandeliers and the whispers, Audrey knew only one thing. She would never let anyone make her feel worthless again. The carriage rattled down the overgrown lane, tree branches scraping against its sides like skeletal fingers. Audrey pressed her face to the window, watching as Ashford Manor emerged through the morning mist, a ghost of its former glory. The stone facade was still noble, still proud, but ivy had claimed the eastern wall, and several windows on the upper floors were dark and broken. The fountain in the circular drive had long since run dry, filled now with dead leaves and forgotten seasons. The gardens that had once been her grandmother's pride were a tangle of wild roses and weeds reaching toward an indifferent sky. "Oh, Audrey," her mother whispered, her voice breaking. "Perhaps we should have stayed." "No." Audrey's voice was firm. She stepped from the carriage, her boots crunching on gravel that hadn't been raked in years. "This is home. This is ours. That's more than anyone in London can take from us." The front door opened with a groan of rusted hinges, and a small, elderly woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore, the housekeeper who had refused every offer to leave when the money ran out, who had stayed loyal to the Ashford name when even distant relatives had turned away. "Miss Audrey," she said, her lined face breaking into a smile even as tears gathered in her eyes. "Welcome home, child. I've kept the east wing habitable, at least. It's not much, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak there." Audrey embraced the old woman, feeling the thin shoulders beneath her worn dress. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore. Thank you for staying." They walked through halls that echoed with emptiness, past rooms covered in dust sheets like shrouded memories. The manor was vast and cold, most of its furniture sold years ago to pay debts. But there was something honest about it. It didn't pretend to be what it wasn't. It didn't whisper cruel things behind her back. That night, Audrey stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the wild gardens bathed in moonlight. Somewhere in London, Jasper was likely at another ball, dancing with Cordelia, discussing investments and railway shares and the practical benefits of marrying for money. Let him, she thought. I will make something of this place. I will restore our name somehow, even if I must do it with my own hands. She didn't know yet that beneath her feet, hidden in the bones of this forgotten estate, lay a fortune that would make the Duke's wealth look like pocket change. The morning sun found Audrey in the overgrown gardens, leather gloves protecting her hands as she tore away dead vines from what had once been her grandmother's rose arbor. Sweat dampened her simple cotton dress, practical clothing she'd never have worn in London, but here it didn't matter. There was no one to judge her. "That's blackthorn you're pulling up," a male voice said behind her. "Terribly stubborn. You'll need shears for the roots." Audrey spun, startled. A man stood at the garden gate, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed like a tradesman in shirt sleeves and work trousers. His dark hair was slightly too long, his face tanned from outdoor work, and his eyes were an unusual shade of gray that seemed to catch the morning light. "I'm sorry," he said, raising his hands in apology. "I didn't mean to frighten you. I'm Ethan. Ethan Blackwell. I've been helping Mrs. Whitmore with repairs around the estate, fixing what I can without payment. Your family's history here matters to people in the village." Audrey felt heat rise to her cheeks, embarrassment mixing with something like gratitude. "You've been working here for free? The Ashfords have been part of this land for 300 years, Ethan said simply. "That means something. Your great-grandfather helped my grandfather start his first business. Some debts aren't measured in coin." He gestured to the tangled garden. "Besides, I hate seeing beautiful things go to ruin." Something in the way he said it made Audrey wonder if he meant the garden or something else entirely. Over the following days, Ethan became a constant presence at the manor. He arrived each morning with tools and quiet competence, repairing broken shutters, clearing the wells, shoring up the stable roof. He worked alongside Audrey without commentary on her fallen status, without pity in his eyes, without the careful distance London society had maintained. "Why are you really doing this?" Audrey asked one afternoon as they sat on the terrace steps, sharing bread and cheese that Mrs. Whitmore had brought out. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the land. Because places like this, they hold stories. They matter. And because you're trying to save it instead of abandoning it. That takes courage. He turned to her, his gray eyes serious. Most people would have sold whatever remained and tried to cling to London society. You chose differently. I didn't have much choice, Audrey said bitterly. You had every choice, Ethan corrected gently. You chose dignity over desperation. That's rare. For the first time since the grand ball, since Jasper's rejection, since the whispers and the humiliation, Audrey felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Something that felt dangerously like hope. The weeks blurred into a routine that felt almost like healing. Each morning, Audrey woke to birdsong instead of carriage wheels, to clean air instead of coal smoke. Each day, she and Ethan worked side by side, clearing, repairing, slowly coaxing beauty back from neglect. They spoke while they worked, not the careful, performative conversation of London drawing rooms, but real words about real things. Ethan told her about growing up in the village, about his father's business, about the books he'd taught himself to read by candlelight. Audrey found herself sharing memories she'd buried. Her father teaching her to ride before he died. Her mother's garden parties before poverty came calling. Even her naive dreams about Jasper before she understood that love and money were separate currencies in his world. He was a fool, Ethan said one evening as they sat by the library fire. The room was still mostly empty, but they'd salvaged 2 chairs and found them surprisingly comfortable. Any man who could walk away from you for something as cold as gold is a fool. Audrey laughed, but it caught in her throat. You don't know me well enough to say that. I know you've been here 6 weeks, Ethan said quietly. I know you could have married some other titled man for security, played the victim, let your mother arrange something practical. Instead, you're here, covered in dirt half the time, fixing a manner that most people would call hopeless. I know you've never once complained, never once acted like this work is beneath you. He paused. I know that matters more than any dowry ever could. Something shifted in the air between them. Audrey felt her breath catch. Ethan, She didn't know how to finish. How to say that somewhere between clearing gardens and sharing meals, between his steady presence and his complete lack of judgment, she'd begun to feel something she'd thought Jasper had destroyed forever. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His palm was calloused from work, warm and solid and real. You don't have to say anything, he told her. I just needed you to know, you're not what he made you feel. You're not worthless because you have no fortune. He smiled, almost shy. You're extraordinary, Audrey Ashford. Exactly as you are. Later that night, alone in her room, Audrey touched her lips and wondered if this was what it felt like to be loved for yourself, rather than what you represented. If this quiet, steady affection was worth more than all of Jasper's practiced charm. She thought it might be. The library had become Audrey's sanctuary, a room full of books that creditors hadn't bothered to take because they deemed them worthless. She spent her evenings there, reading by candlelight, sometimes with Ethan beside her doing the same, their comfortable silence speaking louder than words. It was a cold October evening when she decided to finally tackle the massive stone fireplace. Centuries of soot had blackened it, and she thought cleaning it might help the room feel less abandoned. Mrs. Whitmore had gone to bed, and Ethan had returned to the village, so Audrey worked alone with brush and cloth. The stone seemed loose near the back of the hearth. She pressed it experimentally, and with a grinding sound that made her heart jump, it shifted inward. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside that space was a small iron box, rusted but intact. Audrey's hands shook as she pried it open. Inside lay 2 items: a heavy iron key, ornate and ancient, and a roll of parchment that crackled when she unfolded it. The paper was old, possibly centuries old, and drawn on it in faded ink was a detailed map of the Ashford estate. But it showed buildings that no longer existed, gardens in different configurations, and in the corner, marked with the Ashford family crest, was a notation in elegant script. The King's Trust, for preservation in times of war. May God protect the crown and those loyal to it. Audrey's breath came quick and shallow. She'd heard the legends, of course, every old family had them. Stories of hidden treasures, of fortunes buried during civil wars, of secrets passed down through generations and then lost to time. The Ashfords supposedly had such a story, something about an ancestor who'd protected royal assets during Cromwell's time, but her father had always dismissed it as fairy tale. The map showed a location marked clearly, beneath the old chapel ruins at the eastern edge of the property. Her mind raced. Could it be real? After all these years, could there actually be something hidden on the land? Something that might save the estate, might restore the Ashford name? The next morning, she showed Ethan the map, watching his face carefully for skepticism or mockery. Instead, his eyes widened with genuine wonder. "Your ancestor was Sir Thomas Ashford," he said slowly, tracing the notation with his finger. "I've read about him. He was one of Charles II's most trusted supporters during the Commonwealth period. If the king asked him to hide something," he looked up at her. "Audrey, this might be genuine. Or it might be nothing," she said, trying to protect herself from hope. "It might be an empty vault or just old documents or it might change everything," Ethan finished. "There's only one way to know." They set out that afternoon, map in hand, toward the ruins of the old chapel. The chapel had been abandoned for generations, its roof gone, its walls crumbling back into the earth. Ivy covered everything, and ancient gravestones tilted at drunken angles in the overgrown churchyard. It looked like exactly what it was, a forgotten corner of a forgotten estate. But the map was specific. Beneath the altar, where the stone was marked with the Ashford crest, there should be an entrance. Ethan brought tools from the stable, pry bars, a hammer, lanterns for when they descended into whatever lay below. They worked for hours, clearing away centuries of debris and vegetation, until finally the altar stood revealed. A massive slab of stone carved with the family crest and a Latin phrase Audrey translated as "loyalty above all." The iron key fit perfectly into a lock so hidden she would never have found it without knowing exactly where to look. Ancient mechanisms ground and clicked, resistant at first, then giving way. The altar stone shifted, revealing a dark staircase descending into the earth. "Stay close," Ethan said, lighting a lantern. These steps could be unstable. They descended into darkness, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase seemed to go on forever, cut deep into the bedrock beneath the estate. Then suddenly, it opened into a chamber. Ethan raised the lantern, and Audrey's breath stopped entirely. The vault was enormous, a cathedral carved from living stone, and it was filled with treasure. Gold coins spilled from rotted chests, their surfaces still gleaming after centuries in the dark. Jewels winked in the lamplight, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, diamonds. There were paintings in gilt frames, religious artifacts of incredible craftsmanship, suits of armor that must have belonged to kings. And at the center, in locked iron boxes that still bore royal seals, were documents. Bonds, deeds, certificates of enormous value. "Oh my God," Audrey whispered. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the stone floor, staring at the impossible wealth surrounding her. "It's real. It's all real." Ethan knelt beside her, setting the lantern down. His face was stunned, almost disbelieving. Audrey, this is more than the king's treasury. This could be worth more than most of the noble fortunes in England combined." She started to laugh or maybe cry. She couldn't tell which. All those weeks in London, being dismissed as worthless. Jasper's cold calculation that she had nothing to offer. The whispers about her poverty, her lack of value, her unsuitability as a wife. And all along, beneath her supposedly worthless estate, had been wealth beyond imagination. "He said no dowry, no marriage," she said, her voice breaking. "He said I had nothing." He said love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Ethan took her hands, his touch grounding her in reality. You were always priceless, Audrey. This doesn't change your worth. It just proves what a blind fool he was. She looked at him through tears. This man who had loved her when she appeared to have nothing, who had worked beside her without expectation of payment or reward, who had seen value in her when the entire world had written her off. You didn't know, she whispered. All this time you thought I was poor. I knew you were extraordinary, Ethan said simply. That was enough. In that moment, surrounded by a king's ransom, Audrey understood that she'd already found the real treasure weeks ago. It just hadn't been hidden in a vault. 6 months later, Audrey Ashford stepped from a private carriage in front of Kensington House, and London society held its collective breath. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that cost more than most women's entire wardrobes, and at her throat was a sapphire necklace that had once belonged to a queen. Her hair was dressed by London's finest stylist, and her bearing was that of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Ethan Blackwell walked beside her in evening dress that revealed what Audrey had discovered in the months since the vault. He was no simple tradesman, but rather a wealthy industrialist whose business was actually a manufacturing empire. He'd been assessing investments in the countryside when they'd met, and he'd fallen in love with her believing she was penniless. The irony was exquisite. The grand Christmas ball was in full swing as they entered. The same ballroom where Jasper had rejected her. The same crowd that had whispered about her downfall. But this time the whispers were different. Is that Miss Ashford? I heard she discovered some sort of ancient fortune. They say she's the wealthiest woman in Europe now. Richer than the Queen herself. And that's Ethan Blackwell with her. The industrialist. They say he's worth millions and completely devoted to her. Audrey felt their stares but kept her face serene, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm. She wasn't here for their approval. She was here because she refused to hide, refused to let shame keep her away from what had once been her world. And then she saw him. Duke Jasper Thornfield stood near the refreshment table and he looked diminished. His evening dress was fine but not new, his face drawn and pale. Beside him was no glittering heiress. Apparently Lady Cordelia had abandoned him 6 months ago when a wealthier prospect emerged, leaving Jasper with debts from his extravagant courting and a reputation as a fortune hunter. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Audrey saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, regret, an unmistakable calculation. She turned away, focusing instead on Ethan's warm smile, on the genuine friends who approached to congratulate her, on the life she was building that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. But she knew Jasper wouldn't leave it alone. Men like him never did. Later that evening, she stepped onto the terrace for air, and she was not surprised when she heard his voice behind her. Audrey. She didn't turn immediately, letting him wait the way he'd made her wait so many times before. When she finally faced him, she kept her expression neutral, polite, the face she'd show any acquaintance. Duke Thornfield, she said, her voice cool. How unexpected. Jasper looked worse up close. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached toward her. Audrey, please. I need to speak with you. We are speaking. No, I mean truly speak. About us. About what happened. He took a step closer, and she could smell desperation on him like cheap cologne. I was a fool, Audrey. The greatest fool who ever lived. I let you go because I was blinded by practical concerns, by duty, by money, Audrey finished calmly. You let me go because I had no dowry and Lady Cordelia did. You told me love was a luxury you couldn't afford. I believe those were your exact words. He flinched. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. These past months without you. Watching you from afar. Seeing what you've become. I've realized that I threw away the only woman I've ever truly loved. Loved? Audrey laughed, but there was no humor in it. You loved what I represented, Jasper. You loved the idea of me when I came with social standing and the promise of an easy life. The moment that changed, your love evaporated like morning mist. That's not true, he insisted, and now he did reach for her hand. She let him take it, curious to see how far he would go. I see now that I was blinded by circumstances, by the pressures of my position. But you've always been extraordinary, Audrey. Your grace, your intelligence, your beauty. Those never required wealth to make them valuable. How fortunate that I now have both, she said dryly. Jasper dropped to one knee right there on the terrace, still clutching her hand. Behind them, through the ballroom windows, she could see people beginning to notice, beginning to gather to watch the drama unfold. Audrey Ashford, he said, his voice breaking. I am begging you. Take me back. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that I love you, that I was wrong, that you need my money? Audrey interrupted, her voice cutting through his rehearsed speech. She pulled her hand from his grasp. Because let's be honest, Jasper. Lady Cordelia left you 6 months ago. I've heard your estates are mortgaged to the hilt, that you're facing bankruptcy, that you're desperate for an advantageous marriage to save yourself from ruin. His face went pale. That's not. Don't lie to me, Audrey said, and now there was steel in her voice. Not anymore. You taught me a valuable lesson that night you rejected me. You taught me that money reveals character, that it shows people's true priorities. You chose wealth over love once. Now that our positions are reversed, you're making the same choice again. Only this time, I'm the one with the fortune you're chasing. Please, he whispered. Audrey, please. I made a mistake. I was young and foolish and... You were cruel, she corrected. You humiliated me publicly. You made me feel worthless. You stood in that ballroom and told 200 people that I wasn't good enough because my family had no money. She leaned down so her face was level with his. Do you remember what you said? No dowry, no marriage. As if I was merchandise that failed to meet your standards. Jasper's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. God, Audrey. I'm so sorry. I'm sure you are, Audrey said, straightening. But your apology comes 6 months too late and for all the wrong reasons. You're not sorry you hurt me, Jasper. You're sorry I'm no longer the powerless woman you discarded. Ethan appeared at the terrace doors, his presence steady and reassuring. He took in the scene. Jasper on his knees, Audrey standing over him with ice in her eyes, and came to stand beside her without a word. Jasper looked between them, something desperate and ugly crossing his face. Him? He spat. You choose a tradesman over a duke? Over everything we had together. He's not a tradesman, Audrey said calmly. Though if he were, he would still be worth 10 of you. Ethan Blackwell owns the largest manufacturing empire in England. He's wealthier than you ever were, even before your debts. And more importantly, he loved me when he thought I had nothing. Can you say the same? Jasper's face crumbled. He reached for her again, grasping at her skirts like a drowning man. Please, Audrey. I'm ruined. I have nothing left. You need my money, Audrey finished. The very thing you once rejected me for not having. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so pathetic. She gently removed his hands from her gown. No dowry, no marriage, Jasper. Isn't that what you told me? Well, you have no dowry. You have nothing to offer me except debt and disgrace and desperate pleas. So by your own logic, there can be no marriage between us. She turned to walk away, then paused and looked back at him. He was still on his knees on the cold terrace stones, tears streaming down his face, the picture of abject humiliation. You taught me that money reveals who people really are, she said quietly. But you were wrong about one thing. It doesn't reveal character, it just amplifies what was already there. You were always this man, Jasper. Greedy, calculating, willing to throw away love for financial gain. The only difference is that now everyone can see it. She took Ethan's offered arm and walked back into the ballroom, leaving the Duke broken on the terrace. Behind her, she heard him call her name one last time, heard the desperation in his voice, and felt absolutely nothing. Inside, the ball continued, but now people parted for her like waves before a ship. The whispers were different now, admiring, envious, respectful. She was no longer the object of pity but the source of fascination. The woman who had walked away with a kingdom's treasury, both literally and figuratively. 3 months later, Audrey married Ethan Blackwell in a private ceremony at Ashford Manor. The estate had been fully restored, its gardens blooming again, its halls filled with light and laughter. They honeymooned in Italy, then returned to split their time between London and the countryside, using their combined wealth to fund schools, hospitals, and opportunities for those who had nothing. Jasper Thornfield's estates were eventually sold to pay his creditors. He married a widow of modest means who pitied him, and they lived in quiet obscurity in the north, where fewer people remembered his former glory or his spectacular fall. And Audrey? She discovered that the real treasure had never been the gold in the vault or the jewels in the boxes. It was knowing who loved her when the world said she was worthless. It was rebuilding her life on her own terms. It was choosing dignity over desperation, and genuine love over calculated convenience. On quiet evenings, when she and Ethan sat in the restored library with their children playing at their feet, she would sometimes remember that night at the grand ball when Jasper had destroyed her world with 5 brutal words. "No dowry, no marriage," she would whisper to herself, smiling now at the memory. And then she would look at Ethan, at their children, at the life they'd built together, and think, "Thank God he walked away, because in losing everything, I found what actually mattered." The kingdom's treasury had made her wealthy, but love had made her rich. The end. Dear viewer, what part of this journey touched your heart or surprised you today? If you'd enjoy more historical love stories filled with healing and hope, let me know below. Please like, subscribe, and share to help others find these stories too. Thank you for spending your precious time here. Your next beautiful story is waiting on the screen.